Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Every Elden Ring Boss Ranked Best to Worst, the series where I and Sophie from Sinclair Lore rank all the unique bosses in Elden Ring by our 5 categories of relative difficulty, enjoyment, flair, aesthetics, and uniqueness. Relative difficulty refers to how challenging a boss is relative to its placement within the game. Note that a boss can receive a lower score here for being either too easy or too hard. Enjoyment is simply how fun I found the boss to fight. Flair refers to how flashy and engaging the boss's moveset is. Aesthetics is about how interesting the boss and its area are visually, and uniqueness is about how different the boss is to fight than other bosses and enemies in the game. Note that this does not penalise bosses that are reused. In the event of a tie, the boss with the highest enjoyment score is ranked higher. If the enjoyment score is also tied, then I will simply choose which boss will be ranked higher. In the case of bosses that are used more than once, I have taken my favourite version of that fight and ranked it as if it was the only instance of that fight in the game. Well then, let's rank some bosses. Okay, so welcome back everyone. I'm Alistair, the Knight of the Orchards, and I'm here with Sophie.
Hi.
From Sinclair Lore.
Hi.
And we're going to be going through bosses 11 through 20 of every Elden Ring boss ranked best to worst, which is 133 in total of that, so we will see how far we get. Okay, so starting us off at number 11, we have the Regal Ancestor Spirit, for which I've given 4 points for relative difficulty, 4 points for enjoyability, 4 points for flair, 4 points for aesthetic, and then 4 points for uniqueness. Quite a balanced effect there. So, Sophie, what did you think of the Regal Ancestor Spirit?
Well, we were talking about this off mic, but the first time I played it, there was a glitch. I think they've patched it out now, but it would die in between the phases. So the whole cool thing it does, where it absorbs the animals around it, and it'll absorb their traits. So, like, if it absorbs the rams, it'll get their rolling attack. I think it does something else depending on the other animals it absorbs. I had no idea it did that. I did not know it did any of those things. I just thought, okay, it's a powered up Ancestor Spirit, I've already done this. So it wasn't until much later on that I went back and kind of appreciated it.
Yeah, it's as you say, like, obviously it builds on the original Ancestor Spirit fight, which is a fun fight by itself. But the big difference is that it has that ability to buff itself with the other animals, and importantly to heal.
Yeah.
It's one of, I think, only 2, maybe 3 bosses in the game that can actually heal itself.
Yeah.
And unlike Malenia, it's not total bullshit. So it works because it even though it can heal itself, it can't deal enough damage to you to make that a serious issue by itself.
Well, so it's not healing itself by hurting you, which the other 2 do.
No, exactly. And so it can just kind of deal enough damage to be a threat, but at the same time, it's more that you're outlasting it.
It effectively just means that its health bar is 30% longer than you think it is. That's all it is. Yeah. It can't keep healing itself.
No. Yeah, and also, I mean, the fight itself, it's one of the few bosses that I sort of feel bad about killing, because it's this really clearly kind of beautiful relic of an older time. Yeah. And it's not entirely clear whether you killing it is a good or a bad thing, really, given the whole death worship.
Well, you trespass to do it.
Yeah, you do,
it's not. None of it's never necessary. You're just defiling a corpse.
Yeah.
It's just there. You could leave it alone.
Yeah. But then we are the tarnished, in the grand tradition of the good hunter. So yeah.
Yeah, just gotta constantly
poke things. Yeah. But no, I think the overall look of the fight is really good. The sort of blue, cyan, greens. The music is very kind of calming and soothing. And the way that the spirit attacks by actually jumping around and dropping, it is a very... It's not a particularly difficult fight, although I wouldn't say it's easy, but also it's just really fun and engaging in ways other than just raw difficulty.
Yeah, and the image of, the sort of the spiritual, the spectral kind of animal leaping through the sky is quite effective. It's sort of like a Wild Hunt thing.
Yes, it is.
You can imagine that, there is a myth of there's a stampede of these creatures across the sky or some night. It has that feel. But
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's a good fight because even though it's not too difficult, it's difficult enough to be engaging And it has a very, very different and unique feel to pretty much every other fight in the game.
Yeah.
Again, the only real reason why it's a little lower down on uniqueness is the fact that it does have a lower version of itself in the Ancestor Spirit. But aside from that...
Yeah, that's... I'm sure I've said this before because we've done so many of these, but, like, if I have one criticism of Elden Ring's bosses, it's that a lot of them are blatantly just like, it's a 2-phase boss, but we've included a bunch that are just phase 1.
Yeah, and that does hurt it a little bit. But yeah, so that's the Regal Ancestor Spirits.
Yeah. Number 12, it's Godkin Noble.
The Godkin Noble has, we're going to 4 for relative difficulty, 4 for enjoyment, 4 for flair, 4 for aesthetic, and 4 for uniqueness again. So, yeah, I think for me, what works about this fight, it's one of the few fights outside of Dark Souls 2 that actually uses the arena as a part of the fight.
Yes.
And this is one of those things that I think people really don't give enough credit to Dark Souls 2 for doing. Because, particularly Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, a lot of the fights are just kind of a thing in a room, and you just fight it in an arena, and that's it.
Yeah.
And I quite like it when the arena actually becomes part of the fight. And in this context, obviously, it's because in the second phase, the Godkin Noble will do his jumping and rolling attack, where he'll roll around the arena and try and hit you. And you can use the columns to hide behind as a way of trying to sort of stop that from hitting you, which also means that when you fight him outside of the arena on the Divine Bridge, it's a complete pain in the arse because he just rolls over you consistently.
Absolutely.
Because you're not meant to fight him there.
Yeah. And similarly in Farum Azula.
Yeah.
Where there's still the columns in the arena, but like he overlaps them slightly and you can stand on them. So you might think you can stand on them, but then he'll just slam into the side of the column and squash you.
Oh yeah, we're not getting to the Godskin duo for a long time yet. But yeah, and I think the other thing that I like about the fight is just, again, we've talked about it before with Radahn, but the humour of it. You know, he's this sort of big, burly snake man with a very thin sword, and it completely messes with your perception because you don't think something that large could move that fast. But he does.
Yeah.
And again, like, he jumps up in the air and like inflates and slams down. He rolls around the arena. It's funny, and also it kind of contrasts with the very sort of satanic look of the church.
What I find interesting actually about Godkin Noble is he's almost like, it's almost like two bosses at once. Like you said, he's like a big guy, but he fights like he's a duelist. And I feel like it's almost like if you were fighting like an Ornstein and Smough situation, where it's like a fast little guy and a big strong guy, but they've made them the same boss, and they've given him both, and he's switching between them. Which I find
that's
really
actually a really good point. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. He does sort of combine the two. Obviously they sort of try and redo the Ornstein and Smough with the Godskin duo fight, and it just doesn't work at all. But yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, I also just think that the Godskins by themselves, they obviously have an amazing music track, probably the best in the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also just their whole vibe is really cool. Like, we don't really know what they are, where they come from. They're clearly linked with Destined Death and the Glowmide Queen in some respect. And yeah, I think the Godkin Noble, again, he's elevated by the arena as well as just being a really fun fight by himself. And a perfectly balanced fight if you get there around sort of level 60, 70. Right, so coming in at number 13, we have Lich Dragon Fortisax. He gets 4 points for relative difficulty, 3 points for enjoyment, 5 points for flair, 4 points for aesthetics, and 4 points for uniqueness. I think for me, what works about the Lich Dragon fight, more than anything else, is just that it is a really cool fight to actually engage with. You know, he's got the normal red lightning of the ancient dragons, he's got the golden lightning from Godwyn with the death blight. You fight him, although the arena itself is just a reuse of the Fierce Champions arena. The whole look of it with the sky and the curse is really cool. The problem with the fight is just the fact that he spends way too long in the air. And I mean, obviously he has the death blight on his breath attack, so you can kind of one-shot you. It's a shame because I think with a little bit of tweaking, it could have been a really fun fight, maybe even up there with Placer-Dusax.
Yeah.
But it just ultimately doesn't quite come together in a way that really feels enjoyable to me.
Well, it has the issue that, like, Souls Dragons fights have always had, which is, like you're saying, like, it's going to spend too long in the air. Because if you've designed the combat this way, like, you can't assume the player has ranged weapons.
No, you can't.
So if you're fighting something that can fly, it's going to spend a lot of time in the air, and it's going to land, you're going to hit it, it's going to take off again. Like, it's one of, like... I don't think the series has ever done particularly great with dragons. But the Elden Ring dragons, I think, are, like, the best iteration that they've managed. Like, I like Sin a lot.
I was going to say, I think Sin
the Slumbering Dragon,
Sin works really well also because Dark Souls 2 is based around having more healing items. So you can do, like, outlast bosses in a way that doesn't really work in the other games because you just have a lot more healing.
Also, and the other thing is, Sin, you're fighting Sin in an arena that's like, it's like a cavern underground. It can't get a lot of room above it, and it does a lot of, like, kind of strafing, like, low to the ground attacks.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, like, Fortis Axe, again, it's almost like there's not a huge amount to say about Fortis Axe in a weird way because it's basically just the Ancient Dragon Lanx fight. But again, I think a less engaging because dragons already have the issue with spacing, where, like, you have to keep them away. But then the extra instant death breath attacks also mean that you have to keep away even more. And a lot of the attacks that it has are based around flying up in the air and lunging down at you. So you're spending a lot of time running away from it, dodging away from it. And actually, if you get close to it, it's fine. But then it will just get up in the air again and run away. And also the Lanx fight, which we'll come to, also works better because it's in the open area, so there's a lot of places you can run to, and that's not the case with Fortis Axe.
Oh, I feel like the impression I get with a lot of the dragon fights is, like, they probably designed this assuming the player would be on torrent, and you would be fighting it on horseback, so they can make it move very fast, and then they seem to have scaled back the amount you use torrent, but, like, after they designed the bosses. So there's lots of bosses that, like, you take forever to close the gap. Which would make sense if you were on torrent, but then you think, if I was on torrent, I would constantly be being knocked off, because torrent wouldn't be able to dodge, because torrent has no iframes. So it kind of feels like they maybe constructed them in a certain way, and then it's like, one part of the foundation didn't quite work, and it warped the rest of it.
Yeah, I think I've been quite negative on Fortis Axe. I should say that, like, I still think it's a really good fight, and particularly...
Oh no, yeah, I like
Fortis Axe because it is ultimately like a sort of secret boss fight, so it doesn't necessarily have to be as polished as some of the other ones.
Well, also, to me, like, Fortis Axe is, like, pretty much the only Ancient Dragon I bother fighting, because there's something at the end of it.
Yeah, that's true.
Because, like, the ones in Fire Missoula and Lanx, you can just run past. And I'm like, I only have to fight one of these in the game, I'm going to fight Fortis Axe, I'm going to ignore the rest of them.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, it's still a fun fight. There's a reason it's up here this high. It's just that I think that ultimately it suffers from a lot of the classic Souls issues when it comes to dragon fights. And, you know, it's just kind of a shame because I think, again, with a bit more tweaking, they could have made probably the best classic style dragon fight. And I'd say, to be honest, that probably still goes to Lanx in the sense that Placis Deus Ex isn't really a traditional fight.
So number 14 is Estelle, Natural Born of the Void / Estelle Stars of Darkness. You've given it a 3 for relative difficulty, a 3 for enjoyment, a 4 for flair, a 5 for aesthetics, and a 5 for uniqueness.
Yes, and I should just say I've combined the two. Normally, if there's two different versions of a boss fight, I've done them separately, but the only difference here is that Stars of Darkness has that one grab attack where it spawns lots of imitators, and that's it. So they're just the same here.
Yeah.
Estelle is one of those fights where it looks better than it is to fight, but it looks really good, and it's still fun enough to fight that it just about scrapes up.
I remember the first time I did it, I was describing Estelle as like a version of ROM that I don't hate.
Yeah.
Because I think like what you're saying, like it applies 2 or 3 times as much to ROM, where like the ROM fight in Bloodborne like looks incredible. As a story turning point, it's incredible. It reframes everything you know about the world. The concept behind it is really good. It's extremely compelling, and it's bullshit, and I hate it. Like, it is just absolute chaos, and things that can one-shot you, and things you can't see, and it's just like, I dread doing it. So, Estelle, to me, is like, I think they learned a lot from ROM doing it, because they has a lot of similar moves to it. Like, the meteorites that Estelle throws out.
Yeah.
they are way better than the ROM meteorites, because the ROM meteorites are total chaos. Like, it is just all these random things are flying at you, they're aiming directly at you. It's like a Gatling gun is shooting you the whole time. Estelle fires like a cloud of meteorites that go in your general direction, but they're spread out enough and they're slow enough that you can avoid them consistently, which I like.
Yeah.
And when Estelle teleports around, there's a better tell for where Estelle is going to end up, and also like got the same AoE attack that ROM does, where it'll make these waves come out from under it, but it does it differently. Instead of it being a sudden burst, it'll happen gradually. It'll get like a small one, then a medium one, then a big one, like a shockwave. So it just feels like it's a lot more fair, it's a lot more predictable than ROM is.
Yeah, I think it iterates on the ROM fight. The thing that I find frustrating about Estelle is the fact that it's very much a boss that wants to fight you at medium range. And if you get too close to it, it will run away from you and then reappear. It will teleport and then reappear away at medium range. And that's the sort of same issue that Elden Beast has, in that it's frustrating to constantly run to and fro across the arena. And, I mean, while I would say that Estelle isn't the most damaging enemy in the game, they do have some, like, that's a grab attack where it grabs you, and that's nasty, and it does have some pretty damaging, like the beam attacks and the meteorite attacks, so it can feel a bit cheap. It's also not ideal that you can only really damage it on the head, because again, it means you've got to run towards the bit that's the most dangerous to you. That all being said, I do think, I mean, for one thing, visually it's stunning. Yeah. It's one of the best looking bosses in the game, with the multicolored body and a kind of onyx and crystal look to the whole thing. And again, the flare, I'd say, aside from Radahn, it's got some of the best flare in the entire game. With the meteorite crashes, it picks you up with the gravity and smashes you into the ground. And it does feel like you're fighting some kind of like cosmic entity. You know, it's nothing like anything else in the game, and it's very inhuman. And that's something that, I mean, to be fair, Elden Ring does this better than a lot of Souls games, but there's relatively few bosses or enemies in the Souls games that feel actively inhuman, and Estelle is one of them. So I do like it in a lot of respects. Ultimately, Estelle is a fun fight for what it is. It's a memorable fight, and it's definitely worthy of being, you know, a sort of one of the major bosses. I think it's just a shame that, again, similar with the Lich Dragon, it feels a little undercooked in terms of the actual enjoyment of the fight. There's a real art to making a fight that feels tough but engaging and fair, and Estelle doesn't quite manage to do that.
Yeah. I think also, like, we were talking before about Estelle sort of probably initially having some other role, the way that we know that there's like an alternate Estelle entrance, and the way that you fight Estelle in just like a lake. That's... If you look at the map, in order to have gotten from where you were to the lake, you take this weird, like, fishhook sort of direction that doesn't really make any sense. So I feel like Estelle, there may have been, like... It's like, you know, Radahn is so much about that arena. And the way that, like, a big part of the Radahn enjoyment is, like, you have the big sky above you and he leaps into the air and he comes back down. And it's like, I can imagine this probably, like, a much more visually impressive version of the Estelle fight that we didn't get.
Yes. I think that's almost certainly true. Okay, so coming at number 15, we have Moog or Moog, Lord of Blood. So this might be a little controversial. I've given him 3 for relative difficulty, 2 for enjoyment, 5 for flair, 5 for aesthetics, and 5 for uniqueness. And this is just one of those examples of a fight that is it's just too hard. Or it's hard in a way that isn't enjoyable or fun, and just feels kind of tedious. Like, when I'm fighting Moog, I feel like I'm being assessed in like a job interview or like something like that. It's not that it's too hard in concept. I mean, I actually really like the Orphan of Kos fight, which is a great example of how you do a hard fight that is just on the edge of being frustrating, but never actually becomes frustrating. Whereas with the Moog fight, they've tried a few times to make a fight based around denying the player entry to different areas. And of course, in this case, they do it with the burning blood on the floor. And actually, the first phase of the fight, I think, is fine. It's the second phase when he flies up in the air and he can run all around the room and he can trap you very easily in parts of the arena. And it just feels very awkward and stiff. And I think that's partly because that arena probably wasn't designed for the Moog fight.
No.
Because the Moog, the Omen fight, which I much prefer, And that has a much larger arena, and actually it's much more fun to fight Moog the Omen than it is to fight Moog Lord of Blood. So I think there was some issue happened there, because I don't think that was really how you...
No, absolutely, because you brought up, like, the arena's quite cramped. And they make it even more cramped because they stick all those, like, gravestones and things in it. You brought up Moog the Omen as a way of doing it right. Quelag is also a way of doing it right, because Quelag's arena's fucking massive. And her lava pools last for ages. I didn't notice till I went back to replay Dark Souls, I'd forgotten. But, when Quelag vomits lava, it stays there for a really long time. And it's also significantly more damaging than anything that Moog spits out. But it's such a big arena that if she starts to vomit, you can just run to the other side, and by the time you've dealt with her on that side, they've cleared up. So yeah, the combination of him being able to do area denial stuff in a very small area, he's not affected by the area denial, and he can fly.
Yeah.
It's there's too many sort of variables going on where you can just get caught, and you can't do anything about it. And that's further compounded by his, nihil thing he does halfway through. It's not that damaging if you know what you're doing. You can avoid it. But taking damage regardless just feels bad.
Yeah, because you can't do anything. Even if you have the glass tier, it feels annoying to have to take damage. It's the same issue with Nito, where you have to take the falling damage to fall into his arena. And it just feels why? That feels unnecessary. And I will say though that while I have criticisms of Moog as a boss, he is an excellent elementary Latin tutor. But no, I think, again, it's a shame that Moog has his issues around difficulty, because, again, the look of the fight, the way you fight him, the voice actor does an amazing job. Moog as this kind of very satanic, classical-looking figure with the goat horns and the cardinal robe and the trident. He's a really great look. The sort of raven wing feathers and the way he dives around the arena and he throws blood everywhere. Again, it's a great-looking fight. And I think had it been fought in a different arena, and maybe with a little bit of tweaking, it could have been a really good fight. But it is really let down by just how difficult he is. And I should say, I ranked all these bosses using a strength-based playthrough with no Spirit Ashes. And I think with Spirit Ashes, actually, it was okay when I played it the first time. But solo, it's just an absolute nightmare. And it really isn't very fun.
What I've done, my last Elden Ring playthrough, I was level 25 with a +3 dagger. But I did use Spirit Ashes. And Moog actually goes down pretty quickly, just because he can't really handle more than a few things going on. It took me 4 or 5 attempts, but he went down pretty quickly.
I can see it, as clear as day. The coming of our dynasty.
Okay, so number 16 is Ancient Dragon Lanx, who you've given a 4 for relative difficulty, a 4 for engagement, a 4 for flair, a 4 for aesthetics, and a 3 for uniqueness.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason uniqueness is fairly low is because it's actually quite similar to a lot of the regular dragon fights in a lot of respects.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot better than them, but you're still spending a lot of time running around on Torrent in an open area, kind of hitting ankles and running away. But it's effectively just a much, much better version of the earlier dragon fights. And the game knows that, because by the time you get to Altus Plateau, where you fight Lanx, you've probably fought at least 2 or 3 of the regular dragons that you find in, Caelid and Limgrave and Liurnia of the Lakes. And then you come into Altus and you just start fighting this thing, and it's not just flying around and breathing fire at you, it's also throwing lightning at the ground, it's calling down, it has a lot more variation in how it fights you. And so it seals the idea that this is a fundamentally older and much more deadly version of the things you've been fighting up until that point. And again, I mean, in terms of enjoyment or engagement, it's better than Fortisax, because it's just a much bigger area, and you can fight it on torrent. So you can ride around and feel like St. George and the dragon. You don't have to just kind of fight it on foot and then deal with all the issues around spacing.
Yeah, I think, like, I echo what you said. Like, to me, the issue with it is not an issue with Lanx. It's that by the time you get to Lanx, you've done a worse version of this, like, a bunch of times already. So, finally encountering, like, the best dragon fight in the game, it's somewhat diluted still because you've kind of been through this already. Like, if Lanx had appeared ex nihilo with no sort of, like, dragons leading up to it, or maybe just, if it had just been Agil.
Yeah.
It would have a lot more impact. It's like, okay, like, Agil was a dragon, but now, like, this is, like, a completely different level of dragon. Like, it's a completely different thing. And it's like, you step up from Agil to this, and then step up from Lanx to Placidusax. Like, you would have this 3. But then, like, particularly if you hang around Caelid, and there's just, like, dragons everywhere, it loses that
uniqueness,
sort of oomph. Yeah.
I do agree with that. I think also for me, it's partly the reason it's so high up is I mean, Altus Plateau is my favourite area in the game. And I think that the way that the Ancient Dragon works within Altus Plateau, it just looks really cool when you're fighting it on these golden fields with Lendel in the background and also the tomb kind of behind you. And the dragon itself is white and gold. And it just has this really memorable encounter overall, which I think is actually helped by the fact that it's not in a specific arena, so it just feels like something you're just engaging with, almost like an MMO wandering raid boss or something like that.
Yeah.
I really like the fight, and I think, again, I totally agree with what you said, that Elden Ring does overdo the dragon fights, and that is a problem, particularly if you've explored quite a bit. But yeah, I think it definitely, in terms of, again, those sort of field dragon fights, it's by far the best, and I think it deserves its spot fairly high up on this list. Okay, so then we come to number 17, which is our old friend, Marget the Fell Omen. So he's got 4 for relative difficulty, 4 for enjoyment, 4 for flair, 4 for aesthetic, and 3 for uniqueness. I think that Marget is probably the best introduction boss they've ever done, to be honest. I think he does everything that you'd expect. He gives you a really good introduction to the game's mechanics, while also being a really fun fight in his own right.
Well, he's definitely, I think, the hardest intro boss they've done.
Yes.
It's weird to think of him as an intro boss when, like, it feels like you're supposed to do Weeping Peninsula first. That's leveled low.
Yeah, but nobody does.
But then everyone's pointing you toward... Yeah, because everything points you... Like, literally, you go out and there is the Grace pointing at Stormvale.
I know, it's weird.
Because if you did it in that order, the introductory boss would be Leonine Miss
Which
Madonna.
would also be a good introduction boss, to be honest.
Yeah, but yeah, he's a very tough introductory boss.
He's tough. He's also quite enjoyable as a fight. I mean, I know for a lot of people, and I found this too, first time through, he can be quite frustrating. But it's saved by the fact that, for one thing, although he's, kind of the intro boss, he's also not a required boss. You can just ignore him.
Yeah, you can just run past him.
And you can farm everywhere in Limgrave before going back to him. So it's totally viable to go to him, not do it, go away, level, and come back. I also think that, building on what we talked about earlier, he also works well because he has a unique arena with the long, thin path where he can't fall off, but you can. And it forces you to be quite clever about your spacing, because if you get too close to each side, he will knock you off. It also gives this really nice look when he does his jumping attack, and he jumps and you can see the Erd tree kind of behind him often, or the sort of spires of the castle.
It also discourages you from spamming rolls.
Yes, it does.
Because if you just spam rolls, you will fall off the side.
That combined also with how he interrupts your heals. So, like, if you try and heal, he'll just throw a dagger at you. And so you have to be careful with that. You either have to walk and dodge as you're healing, or you have to wait until the downtime when he's attacked. Again, it's doing that classic Souls boss thing of teaching you spacing, timing, healing, a lot of those basic mechanics, but doing it in a way that feels fun and engaging. And yeah, I mean, obviously, the better and bigger version of this fight is the Morgott fight, where he does a lot more. But yeah, I mean, I think as an introductory fight, and he still does a lot of the kind of fun things, like how his regular attacks and his spectral attacks do different kinds of damage, different amounts of damage, which is quite fun. And yeah, also, again, just the voice actor just absolutely sells it. Marget's voice actor's brilliant. And
He's really good, yeah.
You really get that sense of like, this guy he's so tired. He's so tired of all this bullshit, but he just can't stop himself from continuing it.
I shall remember thee, tarnished, smouldering with thy meager flame. Cower in fear of the night, the hands of the fell omen. Thee no quarter.
So, number 19 is Falling Star Beast, which has a 4 for relative difficulty, a 4 for engagement, a 3 for flair, a 4 for aesthetics, and a 4 for uniqueness.
Yeah, and I should just state here, we're judging the one here in Altus Plateau, not the one in Caelid, because the one in Caelid is just that arena, that tiny enclosed arena, doesn't work with that fight at all, and it just feels.
I think that's been the recurring thing throughout this, which is like, it's not that the game is copy-pasting bosses per se, it's copy-pasting them into arenas where they don't work.
That they were not designed for. Yeah, no, they weren't. And I think, as you say, like the thing about the Falling Star Beast in Altus is it has, because you're fighting it as a field boss, it has enough space to actually do the charges properly, and you have enough space to get around it. We've already judged the full-grown Falling Star Beast, and ultimately the regular Falling Star Beast isn't as good, just because it doesn't have the beam attacks and have a second phase. It doesn't have those medium range attacks. So it's consistently charging at you, which can get a bit tedious, I'm not going to lie. But at the same time, you can fight it on Torrent if you want to. Again, I tend not to in Altus because it often pulls in the enemies from the surrounding area if you do that. But you can do, and if you don't, you're obviously fighting an enemy which is quite like the bull from Sekiro, so lots of charge attacks, lots of attacks at close range. Yeah, I think ultimately it has a lot of the same good things about it that the previous Falling Star Beast did. The look is great, the sort of purple and blue and black, very alien, very unusual. The boss itself is just a fun and engaging fight up close. Not too difficult, not too easy. The only real issue with it is that it just lacks a lot of the sort of second phase attacks that really make the full-grown fight work as well as it does. So, number 19 is Godefroy the Grafted. That's relative difficulty is 4, enjoyment 4, flair 3, aesthetics 4, and uniqueness 4. I should say here again that the reason why the uniqueness is so high, despite being partly reused, is the fact that there's basically nothing else like Godric in the game. He's actually a really unique boss fight, and as a result, even though this is only his first phase, it's still pretty unique because there's just not much else to compare it to. I'm going to go to bat here for reusing the assets, because I know that some people don't like that about Elden Ring. I personally don't have an issue with reusing assets like this, as long as, 1, it makes sense in the lore, and 2, it's actively focusing on a different aspect of the boss fight. And the thing about the Godefroy fight is, in my opinion, it works with the lore because it ties into the whole idea of Godric's lineage and how the golden lineage kind of crumbles over time. If you want to know more about that, I did a podcast with Sinclair Law about the golden lineage, which I'll link in the description. And there's also the fact that I actually think that the first phase of Godric's fight is the best phase.
Yes.
And the second phase only works as well as it does because the arena is large and gives you plenty of cover to hide behind when he does his fire attacks. So doing that in that enclosed Evergaol arena would have been tortuous. It wouldn't have worked.
Well, they kind of do that with Alecto. Yeah, they give her Malekith's, sword flurry AoE, and it's a fucking nightmare to deal with in a tiny space.
Yeah, so for me, even though it is just reusing the first phase of Godric's fight, I think it's actually worth doing because it recontextualizes it and it gives you a different experience. It's not the same as Godric's fight, and it does feel more like a duel, and as a result, you get to appreciate the first phase of Godric's fight more. That being said, I do wish they'd at least done a recolor, or as you said, give him the head of the...
you've got the head of a grafted scion, just shove that in.
Exactly. The fact that it's just a complete visual one-to-one, that does annoy me.
Yeah.
It would have been nice to have something that was different.
Because they do that with other bosses. You will get unique versions of, like the troll, but it's got a Thermish or something.
Or it's got that Carian drip.
Yeah. There's all these little tiny things they do that aren't massive, like just adding a helmet to something. Or there's a troll with no head. Just one little thing, and Godefroy, they could have...
Because also he's actually a fairly important And like most of
Yeah.
the Everjail bosses are kind of like whatever, but actually Godefroy actually is kind of important. So it would have been nice to have
Yeah.
something, but oh well.
So number 20 is Elamar of the Briar. Relative difficulty was 4. Enjoyment was 4. Flair was 4. Aesthetics were 4. And uniqueness was 3.
Yes, so Elamar is kind of a classic Souls fight. He's a bit of a throwback to a lot of the sort of dual fights from the first couple of games, where you just have a knight in a room, and that was kind of the fight. But he works really well because they give him telekinesis sword attacks, and it's amazing how much that actually refreshes the original concept by giving him a lot of medium range potential. So you can't turtle. If you try and turtle him, he will just cut you apart from mid-range because he can hit you, then you can't hit him. So it forces you to be aggressive.
Yeah, again, like, I think going back to Bloodborne again, like, so much of Bloodborne was about forcing you to be aggressive, and I feel like Elden Ring is that, where it's like, a boss like Elamar is designed to be fought a certain way, but also in the game, you can probably have gotten that far without ever having to fight that way. And, like, I can think of a lot, like Malekith is another one. I know you did this, like, with no Spirit Ashes on a strength build. I imagine Malekith was an absolute knight.
Oh, he's fairly low down. It's not even Malekith, it's the Beast Clergyman.
Yeah.
Beast Clergyman is such an absolute pain to fight, because you just get shredded, and you can't... It's just constantly, going with the knife.
Yeah, whereas, like, that's because you're a strength
Yeah.
build, but, like, if you're a katana user, or if you're a magic user, it's completely different.
Yeah.
So that's the oddity around things like Elamar. Like, Elamar wants you to fight a certain way, but you... At no point in the game, up till that point, I think you would have to have fought that way. There's usually a way around it. I remember having so many problems with Elamar, just because I had learned at that point, you can pretty much get through the game by turtling and using guard counters.
Yeah, and then you can't.
And then suddenly it's like, no, you can't do that anymore.
Yeah. That's actually a really good point, yeah.
And, like, that made me think, like, it was initially frustrating, but I'm like, there's other ways of doing this. The issue is, like, you're given a lot of things, but, like, you can also stick to one build, like, 99%
Most
of the time.
Yeah.
So when that 1% hits you, even though the options are there, it still feels a little weird.
Yeah. Elamar as a fight, I think the thing that apart from the fact that they just decided to just put a Sith Lord in Elden Ring, which is just cool.
Yeah.
I also think that aesthetically, the whole look of him with, like, he kind of plays very much of that kind of Black Knight archetype, but actually, like, his armor's rusted and it's filled with chains, and his sword, it doesn't look like a sword. I mean, obviously, it's riffing a bit on Guts' sword because it looks like a flat piece of iron.
Yeah, it's like a black. Yeah. It's like a hunk of metal.
And he also has quite a variety of attacks. He can attack you at medium range, up close, and also do his kind of like push, like force, shove, throw lightsaber thing he does. And also when he has that one really annoying attack where if you're too close to him, you don't get away fast enough, he'll like turn around and hit you, even though it looks like his back's facing you. He's a really fun twist on a classic Souls concept. And like that's probably part of the reason why they decided to make him a recurring boss, because they knew that it was a fun, different kind of fight. But I do agree with you in that I hadn't really thought about it before, but you're right. The fact that he is forcing you to be so aggressive and is so anti-turtle is actually a problem if you've not really had to deal with that up until that point in the game. Because, thinking about it, I can't think of any other bosses, aside from maybe Marget to some extent with his throwing attacks, if you're trying to heal. But most bosses don't punish you that much. Marget, maybe a Horaloo, and that's about it, to be honest. Well, I think that concludes the second episode of every Elden Ring boss ranked best to worst. Thank you for sticking around to the end. Thank you very much to Sophie for coming on.
Oh, thank you for asking me. Thank you.
We'll be doing another one of these that will hopefully be coming out in the not too distant future. And please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Ring the bell to get future updates. And please check out Sinclair Law's channel. Sophie and Sin do great work over there on all sorts of lore topics, often to do with Elden Ring or Bloodborne, but also Outlast and anime. So please do check them out. Finally, it would be great if you guys could check out the video essay I put out a few months ago called Ashen, the first true Souls-like. I'm very proud of that video, and I think it'll be quite interesting for those of you who are into the Souls community more broadly, which I assume is most people who are watching this video, to see how the idea of a Souls-like can be taken and made into something new by a studio with a very different perspective than From Software. So anyway, hopefully we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.